Hello, good morning from Washington, D.C., or good day to whatever time you're watching this video. Welcome to CSIS digitally. My name is Joseph Pyatt. I'm the director of our Energy Security and Climate Change program. We're delighted that you're joining our program today. For those who are watching live, I hope you can join us on Twitter live stream. We'll have an opportunity to have some questions via that channel at the end of our conversation today. I'm delighted to be joined by Ambassador Geoffrey Pyatt. The ambassador is now serving as the Assistant Secretary for Energy Resources at the United States Department of State, but he sits atop a long career, having been ambassador to Greece, Ukraine, and been in the Foreign Service since 1989. The core mission of the Bureau of Energy and Natural Resources, which Ambassador Pyatt leads, is to formulate U.S. international energy policy and diplomacy to ensure a low emissions and secure energy future. The same goals that we have here at our program at CSIS. So I'm delighted to have a conversation with you, sir. I'd like to start actually a little high level before we get into the details of the crazy world we find ourselves in. You've spent so much of your career working in areas where energy was a key factor in statecraft, Ukraine and Greece, both. How does that experience define your vision for how energy should be part of U.S. diplomacy generally and at this moment?
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. It's a really good question. I want to start by saying I'm delighted that this event with CSIS is my first in the Washington think tank world. I was so glad to work with your predecessor, Nico, when he was here, and incredibly proud of his new role now working with Prime Minister Mitsotakis in Greece, but also Heather Conley, and was really delighted to partner with Heather on some of our projects focused on developing a policy framework for the Eastern Mediterranean, which was a big part of my time in Athens. As you said, ENR does the geopolitics of energy. That's my responsibility and the responsibility of the team that I lead. That issue set is more dynamic and complicated today than it's been probably at any time in modern American foreign policy history, certainly at any time in the 10 years since Senator Lugar and Secretary Clinton helped to create this bureau. There are a couple of reasons for that. First and foremost, of course, is February 24th. Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the incredible brutality he has unleashed, but also the fantastic disruption that has caused in global energy prices and the global energy market. You know, I think we can talk about this a bit later, but it's interesting to me, if you look at the last IEA global energy outlook, two really important points there. One, that we've passed the moment of peak Russia. The 2021 was the moment of Russia's highest fossil fuel revenues. It will never recover the status that it had as a reliable energy supplier to world markets. And two, that by the end of the decade, Russia's fossil fuel revenues will be down by about 50%, which is an extraordinary shift of fortunes and presents both opportunities and challenges for ENR's core mission of energy security. The other aspect is the climate crisis, and a lot of things have come together in 2022. One, of course, is the realization of just how severe this challenge is and the urgency of action. Look at what happened in Pakistan over the summer, for instance. But the other, and importantly, is just a couple of weeks before I was confirmed, we had the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's my good fortune to be leading the ENR team at a moment when the United States has the most powerful tool set that we've ever had as a federal government, $370 billion over 10 years, which is going to be a game changer in terms of the U.S. domestic market, but is also going to drive innovation, deployment, investment that's going to create opportunities for the whole world. So, for the ENR team, it's a fascinating moment to be working on all of these issues. My job, one, of course, is European energy security, given the urgency of the situation in Europe today and the disruption that Putin has caused, and the linkage between that and America's national security and our global interests, not to mention our transatlantic and alliance relationships. But we're also focused on the whole world. My first trip in this job was to Europe, necessarily. My next trip just after Thanksgiving will be to Asia, starting with our core allies in Japan and Korea, and then looking into 2023, I'm going to be eager to get back to India, a part of the world where I spent a lot of time, and a country that encapsulates so many of the challenges that we face in the energy transition world, both in terms of access and justice, in terms of supply chains. India, of course, being one of the few countries in the world that has a good shot to challenge the monopoly that China has sought to achieve in certain key aspects of the global energy supply chain, and again, a powerful democracy. So, I think of ENR's job as marshaling the resources of the State Department, our embassies overseas, at a moment when these issues are higher on the bilateral agenda in our diplomacy around the world than they've ever been, but also helping our State Department team globally to leverage the opportunities created by the energy transition, by IRA, by the hunger for American leadership in this space, which was so clear to me when I was at COP last week. So it's a very exciting time to be doing this. I'm incredibly proud to lead the team of foreign service and civil service officers at ENR, and very excited about what we're going to be able to do over the next couple of years.
There's so much to talk about. I'm worried we've only got 20 minutes remaining on our conversation. But so let's start with Europe.
Yeah.
U.S. LNG shipments to Europe are keeping the lights on with the allied countries and preventing an energy crisis that could very clearly perturb European solidarity and support for Ukraine. But this comes with tensions. One, it's been very costly for European allies to buy off of the global LNG market all the gas they need. And two, it's not clear how to build enough capacity, both export capacity here in the U.S., as well as maybe some import capacity in Europe, in a way that's consistent with European climate goals. They're not necessarily inconsistent, but figuring out the right way to thread the needle of energy security and the climate ambition that we see in Europe does seem to be a challenge. What's your assessment of the state of the conversation, and how is the U.S. trying to help our European allies resolve these tensions?
So the conversation, the transatlantic conversation, is very robust. It's happening at the level of President Biden, President von der Leyen. I was glad 2 weeks ago to participate in another session of the US-EU working group led by the White House and by Dita Jorgensen, the DG for Energy on the European side. There's a lot of agreement between us in terms of how we need to work through these issues. The United States has significantly overfulfilled our promise to help Europe find 15 BCM extra in LNG volumes this year. And of course, 2022 is going to be remembered as the year when the United States became the largest LNG exporter in the world. Our capacity is going to grow by about 50% in terms of exports by 2025. But we also, as you said, need to keep working on energy transition. It's clear that for Europe in particular, the greatest source of energy security is a renewable energy future which does not depend on an unpredictable Russia right next door. The good news is, I think decoupling between Europe and Russian energy supplies is real and now permanent. Nobody in Europe will ever again suggest that Russia could be a reliable energy supplier. That in turn has incentivized Europe to accelerate its energy transition. And I saw this so clearly as ambassador in Greece. I, of course, lived in the European Union during the first 3 months of the war in Ukraine, but I also saw Prime Minister Mitsotakis' commitment to leveraging Europe's Recovery and Resilience Fund to accelerate clean energy deployment. I'm also very proud that part of what I saw also there was the opportunities that created for American companies. Right. So, and this is happening in 27 EU member states right now, but just to use the micro example of Greece, I was proud to work with a Texas-based company which is now the largest licensed wind power operator in Greece. I was proud to work with a Boston-based hydrogen fuel cell company that is getting $80 million out of the Recovery and Resilience Fund to lead a project focused on green hydrogen. That's going to repeat itself over and over again because of the billions of dollars of investment and goods that flow across the Atlantic because of our shared interest in advancing this energy transition, and because of how our companies and our markets are intertwined in a mutually beneficial way.
Right. touching on Russia just momentarily, a couple of weeks ago you were speaking at an event here in Washington, and you said the following: the more successful we are in energy transition, the more effectively we use our legacy of fossil fuel assets, I think here you're referring to the United States, the less Vladimir Putin is able to attack our democracies.
Yes.
This is, it seems like there's a lot of agreement in the high ranks of our government and in Europe on this general message. Is that message being received throughout the world?
So I think Russia has demonstrated to everybody that it is not reliable. I've had conversations with colleagues in Central Asia, for instance, where there is deep preoccupation about the revanchist approach that Russia has taken, the violation of international law that the invasion of Ukraine represents, the incredible images that we all see of the human rights abuses that Russian forces have conducted. I think the challenge is, again, that Russia was this major supplier to international markets, but those IEA numbers that I talked about earlier, those are a reality,
right,
and they're not going to go away. And I think Russia has marginalized itself, having weaponized its energy and fired its energy weapon.
Right.
Putin will never be able to do so again. And that has had the effect of accelerating, in a positive way, the focus on alternatives. And you can see it also in terms of the prices. The fact that the marginal cost of renewable power, as Russia's actions have driven up the cost of fossil fuels and fossil resources, it's actually made the switch to renewables more economically compelling. It's made the business case, even if you don't care about the climate benefits.
Right.
So we have to be cognizant of the disruption that Russia has unleashed, working with our allies, our partners, especially in the developing world, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, to help countries manage the shock that their economies have received because of what Russia has done, because of its weaponization of its energy resources. But I think the Rubicon has been crossed in a way that will be beneficial over the long term to global markets, and have reminded everybody of the shadow cost of doing business with a repressive, abusive, unpredictable partner like Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, very interesting. The energy weapon might be like a Derringer. You only get one
Exactly.
shot. You can't
and
miss.
It's been done. It's been used. You can't reload it.
So you mentioned the developing world. You're fresh back from COP in Egypt. Media coverage of the negotiations seems to be pitting the developed world against the developing.
Yeah.
Was that the real timber of conversation, and what was your experience on the ground?
Yeah, not at all in my experience, with a caveat. I wasn't a negotiator. I wasn't in the negotiating rooms. I'll say a couple of things that really stood out for me. One, again, was just how dynamic this moment is, but also the hunger for American leadership. It was impressive to see the attention that the United States got, and especially Secretary Kerry as our head of delegation. I would walk around and see him being stopped for selfies and things. And it was striking also. We worry a lot about China. The Chinese were almost invisible at COP. And I have to conclude that was a deliberate decision. Maybe they were more visible in the negotiating room, but in terms of the pavilions, in terms of the side events, it wasn't there. It was also, I think, important that this was happening in the wake of the IRA. Lots of conversations about how the U.S. energy system was going to evolve. It was important that John Podesta was there for a couple of days also. You have this wild mix of dynamics, Mitsubishi engineers right next to newly elected Brazilian indigenous members of parliament, and the Davos set as well. But what was interesting to me was everybody agreed on the urgency of energy transition.
Right.
There was no debate on that. Everybody agreed that the technology is moving the conversation much faster than folks would have predicted, at the time of the first COP, in terms of the cost of renewables, emerging new technologies. I joked with my team when I came back. If you remember the scene in The Graduate, where they, and I forget the character's name, but says to Dustin Hoffman, young man, there's only one word I want you to remember: plastics. I came back to the team and said, hydrogen. Everybody was talking about green hydrogen and how the green hydrogen economy is evolving, both because of where the technology is, but because everybody agrees that that's going to be a key aspect of meeting the challenge of the climate crisis. And a lot of money is going into new investment in wind and solar connected to hydrogen, in turn connected to global shipping, connected to how to leverage and clean up legacy gas networks, especially in Europe. So a very exciting time in that regard. It was also really useful for me to spend some time with some of the governments from that region, and I talked earlier about the work I did in Athens on the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yep.
So hearing from Minister Al-Mualla in Egypt, hearing from Minister Polides from Cyprus, there is a lot of goodness that is happening right now in terms of this cooperation across the inner sea, as the ancient Athenians used to call it. Very exciting moment in terms of regional cooperation there on energy, grounded on the principle of energy transition as well.
And does that include cooperation on things like hydrogen?
It includes hydrogen, it includes electrification, the idea of deeper cooperation and bringing electricity resources which are potentially bountiful in the Sun Belt that stretches essentially from Egypt across northern Africa, bringing that north to European markets.
Oh, don't get me started about big macro grids, Ambassador.
Yeah, no, there's a lot going on there, which is very positive for our climate goals, but also positive for our interest in fostering cooperation, cooperation between democratic partners, the 3+1 process I was involved in launching with Greece, Israel, and Cyprus, but also new and interesting dynamics in the Middle East, between the Middle East and Europe, and then among European partners as well.
Well, let's touch on two things before we see if we can find a question from online. Cooperation and competition. On the cooperation side, the American government is going out now on riding on the crest of IRA, right? But it's not been met with our allies with universal acclaim, particularly because of the domestic content requirements and other things that are causing real fear that the U.S. isn't going to play nice amidst energy transition. How seriously do you see that problem? What are you hearing from your colleagues in other governments? And what do you think the U.S. can do to respond and really make sure we export the best parts of IRA?
So I'll say a couple of things. First, IRA is a good thing, and we need to do a better job of explaining that if there's any doubt. We have some trade-specific issues that have been raised, especially by our partners in Europe, in Japan, in Korea. I think this is all manageable and will be managed, and I know that the White House is committed to the dialogues that we've launched with all of these parties. But there are also fantastic opportunities. I was talking not long ago with our ambassador in Denmark, which is a great example. In Denmark, you have two big wind power companies, Vestas and Ørsted. Both are expanding opportunities here in the United States based on the incentives that IRA has provided. Vestas looking to grow its wind power manufacturing operations in Colorado. Ørsted providing much of the offshore wind, which will power our homes here in the Northern Virginia area, with Dominion's offshore project in Virginia and Delaware. That story is going to be repeated over and over again, and especially because of the nature of our relationships with Japan, the European Union, Korea. This will be part of my conversation in Tokyo and Seoul, is all the opportunities we see for growing the trade and the investment flows in both ways, and as I said, driving innovation. And it's inherently the case that these developments flow in both ways. The example I always use is the Apollo program. You think about all the innovations. Apollo was about $25 billion of investment in 1970s money. So smaller than the overall IRA footprint. And think about everything that Apollo brought, in terms of advanced computing and semiconductors, advanced materials, aerospace.
Velcro and Tang.
We all live with this stuff, and not to mention space food sticks. But the point is there will be bountiful opportunities for all of us in this. We need to work through the trade aspects of it, but these issues, these supply chains are inherently global.
Right.
One of the challenges I think we're going to face in the IRA world and in an energy transition world is exactly the supply chain for solar, the supply chain for critical minerals. The ENR team has an important initiative called the Mineral Security Partnership to bring together the countries with an endowment of resources like lithium and cobalt with big consumers like the United States, Canada, the European Union, Japan, Korea. Because ultimately, we all have an interest in growing this market, to driving innovation, and making sure that China, a global rival, does not succeed in what it has been trying to do through the past 10 years of industrial policy, which is to monopolize some of these critical clean tech supply chains. And so we don't want to replace vulnerability to Russian energy weaponization with vulnerability to Chinese clean tech weaponization.
Well, let's talk about that competition for just a minute, right? So, whether the frame is where solar cells are made or where critical minerals are built or are extracted and processed, it does seem like the U.S. and the West broadly has lost a step to China. How do you view that as an energy security problem? It's different from being import dependent on oil, but how do you assess it, and how does the government think about potential trade tensions with China and building a more resilient or more strategic supply chain?
So, as I was getting ready for my confirmation process and drilling in on some of this data, Joseph, I asked exactly the same question you did. How did this happen? And it's, no great utility in focusing backwards. The issue now is how do we move ahead? And that's where initiatives like MSP come in. I think China got to this point through 10 years of state-directed investment, industrial policy. The Biden administration has taken some big steps to reset the table, IRA being one, the infrastructure bill being another, and the CHIPS Act being another. All of these are intended to friendshore and to build networks with allies and partners. But these supply chains are inherently global. It's the world that we live in today, and there's certainly no prospect that we're going to create or that we're going to island the U.S. manufacturing economy on these critical issues. We have to work with partners, and as I said, a lot of the growth that's going to happen here in the United States is going to be driven by the Hyundais and the Vestases and the Orsteds of the world. I had a wonderful conversation while I was at COP. I was really glad that we had the governor of Indiana there. And he, first of all, had a very ambitious vision for Indiana's energy transition in a heartland manufacturing state that had some of the largest coal power in any place in the United States. He was all in on wind, on solar, on hydrogen, on carbon capture, on driving electrification of the automobile manufacturing infrastructure in Indiana, on attracting companies like Vestas and others to manufacture in his state as well. That's happening everywhere, and I'm a Californian, so I have seen this in my own lifetime as well. And obviously, California is really setting the pace in terms of the transition of an economy and the economic opportunities that creates for Americans.
So did you become a diplomat because you wanted to know if there was a better place on earth than La Jolla, California?
I'll tell you how I became a diplomat because, and I think the thing that affected me in terms of growing up in San Diego is, I was a child of the 60s and 70s as the process that eventually became NAFTA came to be. And it was very clear to me that the border was less a line than it was a band of, 100 miles, 50 miles on each side of the border where the economies were intertwined and the people were moving back and forth. And it really sort of gave me a sense of how important and significant those international partnerships were. I came into the State Department in 1984, was my first job as an intern working in what became the Western Hemisphere Affairs Bureau, really focused on Latin America. And soon thereafter, the State Department sent me off to India, and the rest is history,
right.
Which is the nature of this profession. But I got interested in these issues because of the importance that I saw behind the decisions and the actions that the U.S. takes, and that was in particularly so as ambassador, both in Ukraine and in Greece. It was incredibly humbling to have regular folks come up to you on the street and say, "Ambassador, you don't know me, but I want to say thank you for what the United States is doing to help our country," which is humbling. I should say a word on COP before we get off of that.
Yeah, please.
One of the most moving things that I was able to do when I was at COP was visit the Ukrainian pavilion. And I have been asked by Secretary Blinken to lead the U.S. government response to help build resilience in the Ukrainian energy economy in the face of Russia's attacks. And it was so inspiring to meet their Ukrainian officials, Ukrainian ministers, and to be reminded both of their incredible courage and resilience and unwillingness to bend in the face of Russia's actions, but also a fantastically ambitious vision for energy transition, for green hydrogen, for building up Ukraine, post-war Ukraine, and there will be post-war Ukraine, as a major hydrogen hub for Europe. So, again, reminded me of the importance of what we're all doing, the effort that President Biden has led to help ensure that Putin fails and is held accountable for what he has done to the whole world through this invasion.
Yeah, and if I may plug Moment, our colleagues here have been working on similar issues, not just for the power sector, but for much of the effort that's going to have to underlie Ukrainian reconstruction. I know we've probably shown you that work, and we look forward to assisting you in any way we can.
Thank you.
It's really important at this moment. I'd like to touch on one final issue before we close. We have a lot of students who watch our work. What is, the tricky part of living in a world in transition is it's a little hard to predict things. What does U.S. energy diplomacy look like in 10 years?
Yeah, fantastic question. If we were having this conversation in 2012, nobody would have predicted the invasion of Ukraine. Nobody would have predicted the shale gas revolution and the fact that the United States would become the largest LNG gas exporter in the world. Nobody would have predicted the dramatic reductions in the marginal cost of renewables, especially wind and solar. So I'm very humble about anything that involves pulling out a crystal ball, but I think the two things that are dead certain are, first of all, energy transition is going to happen. That is, we have reached an inflection point, and the fossil fuel energy system era is coming to an end, and we are evolving into the renewables era. It's not a light switch, and it's going to have to be managed based on the circumstances of individual countries, but there is no turning back. So I think it's going to be a very exciting time in that regard. And the second is that our international partnerships are going to be more important than ever. And I say this as somebody who, as you said, I joined the Foreign Service almost the same moment that the Berlin Wall came down. So my career was marked by the time of American preeminence. We were the indispensable power, as Secretary Albright used to like to say. The next decade is going to be more complicated because we face international adversaries, China in particular, which has a very ambitious vision for its future role and does not share our outlook on how the international system ought to be organized. But that will place an even greater premium on our international partnerships. And to come back to the point I made about COP, America's voice matters so much. It's one of the great privileges of being in this role is people want to know, what does the United States think? What is America going to do? We are still the greatest force for good in the world, in terms of the international system, in terms of the openness of our economy, in terms of the democratic foundations of our political system. We have to hold on to that, we have to leverage that, and we have to build the networks that are going to help to advance the interests that the United States and our allies hold in common. So it's a nice way to finish the conversation because it brings us back to where we started, which is the importance of the energy diplomacy that ENR leads on and the centrality of these energy issues to shaping the contours of the global economy in the years and decades to come.
Well, Ambassador, thank you very much for your service, and thank you for coming to CSIS today and your long years of friendship with our program. I hope they continue.
I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks, Joseph.
Thank you very much. Colleagues and friends from the live stream, thank you very much. We are signing off.